Hey, how's it going? Today we are going to examine the concept of truth in philosophy and also pragmatism. And the author that we're examining is William James. William James writes a short essay, What is Pragmatism, in 1904. And there's more than one type of pragmatism, but there's also more than one definition of truth. So our goals are fairly modest: to survey the three primary theories of truth in philosophy, as well as get a sense of how the pragmatist view of truth differs from these other two versions of truth, which are sometimes called the correspondence theory of truth and also the coherence theory of truth. Pragmatism, you've probably heard this word. When someone says they're pragmatic, it means that their activities are focused on getting practical results, right? So the word practice and praxis and practical, they're all refer to pragmatism, right? And so it's not as if pragmatic is just a word that's used in philosophy, right? So people who are good at solving real world problems rather than just theoretical intellectual problems, that is sometimes described as a pragmatist orientation. So before we dive into pragmatism, let me just give you a background of the other two theories of truth, which are more common, I think. The first one is called the correspondence theory of truth. And correspondence theory of truth is this idea that when we make statements about the world or we represent the world, our representations, our propositions, our statements about the world actually correspond to the way things are, right? Or this ideal state of affairs. So if I say, there's a rock in this yard, and there is a rock, my sentence corresponds to the way things are. And so that's pretty easy to understand, the correspondence theory of truth, which is also known as truth as adequation. Actually, that might be one of the most common uses of the word truth when in an everyday sense. But there's also another theory of truth called the coherence theory of truth. And coherence, when something is coherent, it just means it hangs together well with other beliefs, right? So coherence strives to have consistent beliefs about the world or representations. So if you have a representation or story about the world that contradicts itself, that cannot be consistent, right? And suppose you committed a crime and you're in a gang, like the James gang. By the way, William James, the pragmatist, is not in Jesse James's gang. Jesse James was an American outlaw, not a nice dude. Where I think William James was probably a decent guy, right? But suppose in the James gang, they commit a crime and they get captured, right? They have to come up with a consistent story, because if criminal gang members start telling inconsistent stories, it fails the coherence test, right? So that's the other sense of philosophy's definition of truth. There's correspondence, whether our statements or representations about the world correspond to the way things are, also called truth as adequation. But there's also the coherence idea, right? Do we have consistent beliefs that hang together? So when people are found out to be lying, sometimes they get caught in a lie because they say two things that both can't be true. But James focuses on a radically different sense of truth for philosophy, and he uses it as a means to solve what he calls metaphysical disputes, right? So earlier we looked at some accounts of freedom. How do you prove the existence of freedom? It's hard, right? After Kant in philosophy, right? Kant winds up saying that that there might be some things that we can't prove through human reason one way or the other, and he names things like God, freedom, and immortality. So what if you couldn't decide whether those things were real or not based upon proofs or conclusive evidence? Is there someone or some way else to try to evaluate those questions of what you should do, right? And he says, look, does it make a difference in anyone's life? If it can be traced back to a concrete difference, that's what counts, right? And so Does it matter whether you believe in God or not? If you can't decide it on theoretical grounds, does it have any practical benefits, either positive or negative, or maybe a freedom? So he's a moralist, by the way. He's defending religious belief. But what about freedom? People have argued that there's no free will. There is a free will. What if it turns out that we can't decide that through theory alone? Is there some other ground that we can appeal to? How about practical experience? What difference does it actually make whether you believe someone's free or not? Or even he talks about things like love. What if someone tells you, oh, you can't prove love exists? Does it matter in practical reality whether love exists? And how does it influence a person's life? So the pragmatist theory of truth measures truth in terms of its use value. So sometimes it's criticized on the grounds that, oh, it's confusing the good with the true, right? In other words, what is philosophy good for, right? If philosophy can't make a real difference in the world, then it's kind of useless in a way. And he says, look, this is just a method to resolve some types of disputes that would otherwise seem not to be able to be resolved. So he says pragmatism has no dogma or any specific doctrines except for trying to make a world formula that can be used in the service of human beings, right? So there's a famous Rhode Island philosopher, actually Bishop Berkeley, right? He spells his name Berkeley, but he pronounces it Barkley. Right? Why is that? I don't know. But for years, I've helped direct or co-direct the Rhode Island Philosophical Society and the International Barclay Societies in Rhode Island. But he's this philosopher who's famous for asking, as an absolute idealist, right? He denied the existence of the physical world. He said the material world is an illusion. There's nothing but ideas, right? So there's no such thing as physical substance. Talk about denial. Not only does he deny he has a problem, he denies that there's even such a thing called substance. Anyway, Berkeley winds up asking this question. If a tree falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, if it should be true or not, the answer to that question, does a tree in the forest, if no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? If it turns out to be true or false, will you live your life in any different way? And most people say, no. And so what this suggests is that that is an idle, hey, this tree did fall. Did you make a sound when you fell? These disputes are idle. Right? And it's junk philosophy because it can't make a practical difference somewhere, somewhen, somehow to someone, right? So philosophy is being held accountable to make a difference in the world in terms of its use value. I mean, there's a good side to this in that it gets results. So pragmatists don't concern themselves with these abstract sort of metaphysical questions, but how to deal with practical things. How do you stop a pandemic? How do we make sure people can live with enough food and housing, right? Practical, real-world problems are important for pragmatists, and that distinguishes the pragmatist theory. And James says, look, this is the empiricist attitude. If someone's an empiricist, they use experience as the basis of their theory of reality, right? But it's a more radical function because in the history of philosophy, empiricists sometimes just refer to sense perception as opposed to ideas. But he wants to say, what is the cash value of our experiences, right? How do we make an actual difference in the world? And that's why pragmatism is very powerful in terms of trying to make a difference. James calls it an anti-intellectual standpoint because it no longer has tolerance for playing metaphysical games where philosophy just becomes this dispute of abstract questions. Philosophy needs to be held accountable to make a difference in the world. What is good about it is also bad about it, though, right? Pragmatism can be attacked for confusing the good with the true, right? What's philosophy good for is really what it's saying. So, and it also has no deep theory of truth. But a pragmatist, why should they need a deep theory of truth? What they got is more important, making a difference. Oh,